Well, Steve, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to meet with me and allow me to really ask you some questions. One about your role at Southeast Christian Church, and more importantly, how your executive role plays into this culture of stewardship and generosity that you guys have built and continue to foster at Southeast. But first, I'd like to start out with letting you share your journey, your story about how you've joined the Southeast community, but then also your history there. You've been there for a long time and you've had several roles. So I'd love for you to share that with our audience. And then we'll get into some of the questions that I want to ask you today.
Well, thanks, Leo. My wife and I have been actually part of Southeast Christian Church for 37 years, so for a very long time. But I joined our staff as the stewardship pastor after a 24-year career in the marketplace. And that was about 9.5 years ago, just to give you some context. But prior to that, joining the staff, I had also served as an elder, as a lay elder of the church for about 12 years. So being a leader in the church, I was familiar with, but I had to learn what it meant to be a member of our staff. And that was new to me at 45 years old. That was a pretty big challenge, but I have loved every bit of it. Southeast is an elder-led church, and Dave Stone was the senior pastor when I joined the staff. And at that time, the reason I was brought on board into this role of stewardship pastor was because the elders and Dave had a really strong vision for a discipleship-focused stewardship ministry. So my job was to be the carrier of that vision, to put legs on it. I didn't have to push them to care about stewardship. They cared deeply about it and wanted somebody full-time to do that. And over those years, by God's grace, I was able to build a fairly thriving stewardship ministry. Now, when I started, it was just me and one other staff who was there already focused on benevolence. But we did not have a stewardship ministry at all. And I kind of built it from the ground up. Over time, I added 2 more roles to the team. We added an administrative assistant, a real partner in our ministry for getting all the administrative things done. And I added an associate stewardship ministry, Steve Young, 3 or 4 years ago. But about a year and a half ago, our current senior pastor, Kyle Eidelman, invited me to join the senior leadership team as the executive pastor of ministry support. And I remember that conversation, Leo, in which one of my first reactions was that I was very honored to be asked by him to serve in that role. And there's a lot of my past experience and my giftedness that I felt very called to that kind of a role. But I had in my heart this like tug that says, but what about stewardship? And so I said to him, I said, look, Kyle, my only ask if I were to step into this role would be that I could keep oversight of an involvement in stewardship ministry. And I remember what Kyle said. He said, Steve, I can't think of a better way for you to elevate stewardship than with the position you'll now have as executive pastor. And you'll have my full support to do whatever you think is needed. And Leo, after that, I was sold. I was ready to go. And that has certainly been true. In fact, in 2025, 2026, we'll be leading our church through a 2-year discipleship journey and generosity initiative, something I could not have seen us doing prior to me coming on as an executive pastor. And I can say with confidence now that Kyle and our leadership, we're all in on stewardship and generosity at a level that didn't exist before that. And it's pretty exciting times right now.
Yeah, man, you're definitely fortunate. Not only because they recognized all the effort you put in. I've noticed that some of my friends who have served as stewardship leaders in very large churches, most of you, if we share those, you would know their names, you would know who started those churches, and they served in those roles for a long time. And then because they were so good at their job, right, they're good stewards, they were promoted because they were doing a great job. But many times, unfortunately, when they were taken out of that stewardship role, they were completely disconnected from that role. And it's kind of a heartbreak for me because I think, gosh, you had someone that was doing a great job. And yes, they were a good manager, they were a good employee, they were effective, productive, all those things. But yet you took them from their passion and you had someone that was passionate and gifted. And sometimes churches do that. And I understand staff needs, I understand all that. But I'm so grateful that your pastor not only saw that, but listened to your question as, can I still do this? Can I still oversee this? And not only to say yes, but he said, I can't think of a better way for you to support and continue to grow that. And that's fantastic. I just want to tell you that that's such a wonderful thing because it shows the value that your leadership puts on having a culture of good stewardship and generosity. So that's awesome. So now you've been in this role, what, for a little over a year, I would say a year, year and a half. Has your view of stewardship changed? And if it has, how? And just tell us how that has evolved over the last year and a half now that you're in this different role.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, of course, I still see it as the most important ministry of the church. But that, all joking aside, it's really helped me in this role to see even more clearly how integrated stewardship and generosity should be in the church's discipleship efforts and strategies.
Mm,
I couldn't see that to the degree that I see it now as an executive leader in the church. One of the things I really agree with that we teach in CSN Stewardship Impact Workshop is that it's not wise to use the church's giving totals to measure the effectiveness of a stewardship leader.
yeah.
But in my role now, on the other hand, I have this greater ownership of all aspects of discipleship and engagement in the church, and that includes our giving. And my view of stewardship has really helped me as a leader to respond to what our giving data is saying with a discipleship focus versus what I think could be a temptation of a leader to have much more of a fundraising focus.
Mm-hmm.
So what I want and what we want as a leadership of our church is for every man, woman, and child in our church to fully engage with the Lord and his word and what it means to go on this journey of stewardship and generosity. And that's the part that God's given to us to play as the leaders of his church. And if we can win at that, I can trust the Lord with the rest, with the amount that's going to be given to the church. And so that's been a way that in leadership, I've been able to understand, yes, we probably have some room to grow as a church in this area of generosity and giving. But the approach I'm taking is being informed from a stewardship, discipleship focus, as opposed to a fundraising focus. I'll tell you another thing, if you don't mind me sharing, Leo, that has surprised me in my role as a leader that I didn't see coming. And that is that I have a much greater interest in seeing our staff grow in stewardship.
Love that.
A leader's role is about vision and strategy, but it's also about culture and people. And in my role, one of my primary functions is to build a strong culture on our staff team. And
Yeah.
so as I put my focus on that, God has grown in me a greater desire to see all of our staff go through our financial foundations class that in hopes that it would change their hearts and their behaviors around stewardship and generosity. And so a few things I've done with that already is that this year I asked our stewardship team to start regularly offering this class throughout the work week with an offer to our staff to participate in it on the clock, so to speak.
Yeah.
And we're even considering now making it a mandatory thing for all new hires beginning next year. Those are things that as a stewardship leader, I probably wouldn't have championed or thought was all that important. I was very focused on the congregation, cared about our staff, but there's only so much time, in the week.
Mm-hmm.
But now as a leader, I just see how important it is because the speed of the leader is the speed of the team, right? And we've got to get this in the hearts and minds of our staff. Another thing we did with this was we took the time to clarify our staff expectations this year as we did a complete overhaul of our staff handbook. And in that, we included the expectation of tithing to the church. And we talked about it as we rolled out this overhauled staff handbook in a very tangible way. And it's created a lot of great conversations with our staff around that topic of tithing and generosity and where they're at with that. And last year, we reinforced that by adding giving to one of several spiritual disciplines that we focused on in their annual performance review. And I could tell story after story of how people responded to that and have made some real heart and mind changes around that in this last year. It's been exciting to see. So those are two things that come to mind about how my leadership has been influenced and how I've sort of seen things differently as a leader.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing those. Those are some great also some great ideas for some of the pastors that are listening of how they can incorporate and really expand this culture of generosity that we want in our churches. It really does start with the leadership, right? If they get it, then they can infuse it throughout the congregation. You guys have several sayings at Southeast, and one of them is called "empty the jar." Tell
Yeah.
us what that means and why do you use it?
Yeah, it's one of our 5 mantras as a church, and we use the term mantra. You might call it a core value at your church, but the empty the jar mantra is really our generosity mantra. And it comes from a biblical reference. In Luke chapter 7, there's a story in there of Jesus at the house of Simon the Pharisee, and he's lounging there, eating dinner with him. And in comes this woman that's described as a sinful woman. And she has obviously had some kind of interaction with Jesus that caused her to come and see him that evening. And she recognizes that his feet hasn't been washed. And so with what she does is she takes her alabaster jar of perfume, which probably represents a lot of different things. It's everything she had. It was part of her work that she did, which was a sinful thing, right? And it was her saying, I'm going to pour all of this out. So she pours it out on Jesus's feet in this sort of response to what Jesus has done for her, the forgiveness that she's received, the grace that she's received from him, whatever that is. And so what we want, we talk about this in the CSN Stewardship Impact Workshop about these different levels of a steward and how you kind of move from being someone who, God maybe owns 10%, but I own the rest. And then you move to this place where you're kind of an obedient steward, right? And you give that to God and out of obedience. But the final one, if you remember in our workshop, the final one's called the love-inspired steward.
Yeah.
And that's really where, we want people to get to. And so what I love about our empty the jar mantra is that it's a call to this love-inspired stewardship, right? This idea that out of our love for Jesus, out of our recognition of the fact that he poured out his life for us on the cross, we're willing to surrender and pour out everything we have back to him because, frankly, he owns it all anyway, and it's all for him. And it comes out of our love for him, not just out of our obedience. And so anyway, we try to talk about that empty the jar a lot. You'll in fact see it even as our end of year offering. A lot of times we call the empty the jar offering, and everybody around here just knows what that means when we say it. It's been really powerful for us.
That's great. Well, it's memorable. It's easy to use and to insert into so many different ways, and I think it's a perfect way to continue to bring up this desire, right? To stay committed, to stay surrendered, and it does emphasize that our whole life is stewardship and generosity. That we're to give it all away, right? We're not to hold it. It doesn't belong to us, and so I do like that a lot. All right. So, how do you champion the ministry of stewardship and generosity to your senior leadership? From the position you hold, you have a unique position. So, how
Yeah.
do you champion that?
Yeah, this was something I recognized a few years ago, even before becoming an executive pastor, but even more so today, I've stepped into that. The need to intentionally leverage my relationship with Kyle and the elders to influence them, to help them to prioritize stewardship and generosity. One of the things I've done is put together a 10-part strategy that I took to the elders, presented it to them, and they approved it and then started rolling it out. But here's what I would say. It's one thing to kind of get their buy-in and, approval and all of that in a moment in time. But this is something we have to learn as stewardship leaders and as leaders in general. You got to continue to cast that vision over time because they forget it, right? It's real slippery and you got to compete with so many things for attention. And so with our senior leaders, I've had to continually do that. A couple of the things I've done, Leo, let me share a couple of them, just tangible things. One is I hosted a one-day generosity retreat for our top 20 leaders on our staff.
Nice.
It's similar in feel and content to Generous Giving's Journey of Generosity, if you know that experience. And I told Kyle and the other XPs that I really needed them there to show the priority that this was. And I don't mind telling you this story. I don't think Kyle would mind me telling this story, but the day before, his assistant tells me that he can only come for the first part and then he was going to have to leave. And I was a little discouraged, to say the least. But I, honor him, and I'm sure he thought he had a good reason for that. So myself and one of the elders were leading the retreat, and after the first session, Kyle had been so moved by it that he rearranged his schedule so he could stay for the remainder of the session.
Nice.
And late that night, I got a text he sent to me in which he shared how powerful it was for him personally. And he shared something that he and Desiree had decided that night to do in response to what he had experienced that day, as just an act of, response to the Lord and what he had done in his heart that day. So I share that story as an encouragement to others. Don't give up, right? Just keep working on your senior leaders in that way. There's a lot competing for their attention, but it's a powerful thing when you can do that. Someone once said, generous churches are led by generous pastors. And the question we have to answer, whether we're an executive pastor or stewardship leader, whatever that is how does God want to use me to honor my senior pastor and the elders' leadership and encourage them to grow as generous stewards? And so you just look for opportunities to do that. Another thing I've done with our elders, I worked with the chairman of the elders to encourage all of the elders and their spouses to participate in a Journey of Generosity retreat. And
Nice.
so each year I set up 2 of these at one of our church members' lake home. And to date, we've hosted, 5, 6 of them over the last several years. And over half of our elders have been able to participate so far, and we're just going to keep working on that until we get caught up and have all of them. And next year, we're going to launch an elder development program that will have some required training aspects, of which I'm excited to share that the jog will be mandatory for all new elders as they come on board. And so this is another way to kind of get this in the hearts of our senior leaders so that they can help us lead this out in that way. I attend most of our monthly elder meetings, and there's a couple things I do in that environment to champion generosity and stewardship. I always include something from our stewardship ministry in my monthly ministry report. Keeps it kind of top of their mind. And twice a year, I share an executive summary of the church's giving metrics, which always generates a dialogue about our discipleship efforts and stewardship and generosity. And that's just been a really, really healthy thing. I love it when they're kind of pushing and going, what are we doing? Are we doing enough? Those are the kind of conversations I'd rather be having than to have them just be absent or passive in that area. I don't want to leave out our campus pastors. If you're a multi-site church, we've got about 12 campus pastors. And a couple of years ago, I hosted a 3-hour training over lunch to kind of roll out some things we were going to do, where they were going to do weekly in-service giving moments. And as part of that, I set up a structure where once a quarter, I meet with them. So even in my executive pastor role today, to keep pushing stewardship, I meet with every campus pastor once a quarter to do a one-on-one with them, and I share 6 discipleship-focused metrics for the campus that they lead. And then I kind of coach them on 1 or 2 things that kind of stand out that they can be doing to disciple their campus better in that area. And it's been really cool to see how over time they've increasingly taken ownership for stewardship and generosity at their campus. And now they're telling me the stories of the impact that their efforts and the stewardship ministry's efforts at their campus are making, instead of me having to tell them or push them. And it's been pretty exciting to see that. So, Leo, this has taken time for me, but now most of our staff and leaders get it. And in the last 2 years, I've seen stewardship and generosity get a priority that it didn't have even before I became executive pastor. And I could go on and list all kinds of things that we're now doing. And frankly, over the last year, in this year to date, we've seen a 10% increase in giving households at our church. We've had a 48% increase in first-time givers, which is very exciting to me. And more people than ever are engaging in our stewardship ministry classes and programs. And so pretty pumped about how things are going. Always got more that we can do, but this is the difference that it can make when an executive leader can be involved in stewardship.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that's really what why I wanted you to share because there are executive pastors out there that have very good understanding of what this ministry should be like, but it's hard for them to communicate that. And coming from you and your experience, not only having that stewardship background, but now being able to understand how to leverage your position to be able to make an impact, not in a coercive way, in a very beautiful, inviting way, right? I mean, what you're doing for your staff, what you're doing for the elders is really trying to do something they want, which is to disciple people at a deep level. And
Mhm.
you have this unique position. So thank you for taking the time to share that. I know we could talk about a lot more, but just because we have limited time, I just want to thank you, Steve, for taking the time. And I know it's going to be helpful for those that are listening. Thanks again.
You're welcome.